In this episode, our journey moves from the origins of Scrum into the period that transformed it into a globally adopted approach to agile product development. We'll begin with the Agile Revolution of 2001 and explore how it created the environment in which Scrum could flourish. From there, we'll follow the birth and evolution of the Scrum Guide through its 6 official editions, and uncover why intentional minimalism became one of Scrum's defining philosophies. We'll then see how Scrum expanded across industries and encountered new challenges that went beyond the scope of the original guide. Finally, we'll connect this evolution to the PMP perspective, and see why these developments set the stage for the next chapter of our journey, the Scrum Guide Expanded. Scrum did not become a global standard overnight. This episode traces its evolution from the Agile Revolution in 2001, through the first Scrum Guide in 2010, to the major refinements of 2013, 2016, and 2017, and the transformational 2020 guide. We'll see how Scrum evolved from an emerging software practice into a global framework for managing complex work. Scrum's story began well before the Agile Manifesto. In 1986, Takeuchi Nonaka described a rugby-style approach to product development. In the 1990s, Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber translated these ideas into an emerging software practice. So, by 2001, Scrum already had more than a decade of empirical and structural foundations. But traditional predictive planning struggled with complex, changing work. Long development cycles brought delays, rising costs, limited visibility, and requirements that could become obsolete before launch. The alternative was empirical: build, inspect, adapt, and learn, rather than simply plan, build, and deliver. Then came a defining moment. In February 2001, 17 practitioners gathered at Snowbird, Utah, and articulated a shared alternative to documentation-heavy development. The Agile Manifesto gave adaptive development its philosophy: value people, working software, collaboration, and responsiveness to change. But Agile was a philosophy. The next question was, what framework would turn that philosophy into practice? Here's the crucial distinction. Agile established the mindset: adaptability, collaboration, customer focus, and responsiveness to change. Scrum provided the operational structure, a lightweight framework for empirical delivery. They were complementary, not interchangeable. Agile shaped the philosophy. Scrum made it actionable. From 2002 to 2009, Scrum moved rapidly from an emerging practice to global adoption. It spread across continents, supported by training, practitioner communities, and growing use in software and enterprise IT. But success created a new problem. Without a unified guide, Scrum was being interpreted and practiced in increasingly different ways. But rapid adoption came with a cost: fragmentation. Scrum became mechanical in some organizations, rigid rituals replacing genuine empirical management. Roles were also distorted, with Scrum Masters acting like traditional managers and product owners lacking real authority. Even the artifacts could lose their purpose. Product backlogs became fixed specification documents, while increments lacked meaningful, done, quality standards. The consequence was significant. Different organizations were calling very different practices Scrum. A common understanding was becoming essential. By 2010, Scrum's rapid growth had created a clear need for a common reference point. Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland introduced the first official Scrum Guide, establishing one shared definition of the framework. It organized Scrum around 3 accountabilities: the product owner, Scrum Master, and developers, 5 events, from the sprint and sprint planning through the review and retrospective, and 3 artifacts: the product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. But the guide was deliberately minimal. It defined the essential structure needed for empirical management, without prescribing exactly how every organization should implement Scrum. That balance, enough structure to preserve Scrum, but enough freedom to adapt it, became a defining characteristic of the Scrum Guide. So what did this minimalist architecture actually look like? At its core were three artifacts: the product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. These worked within a 5-event loop: sprint planning, the sprint, daily scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective, supported by 3 accountabilities: product owner, scrum master, and developers. Together, these elements provided enough structure for transparency, inspection, and adaptation. But equally important, the framework left enough freedom for teams to adapt Scrum to their own context. That balance between structure and freedom was central to Scrum's ability to scale across different environments. From 2011 to 2017, Scrum's structure remained deliberately small, but its meaning became clearer. In 2011, the language shifted toward forecasting sprint backlogs in complex environments. In 2013, greater emphasis was placed on artifact transparency, including the definition of done and refinement. Then, in 2016, the 5 Scrum values, commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect, were added to the core. And in 2017, the sprint goal was elevated as a unifying purpose for adaptation. The important pattern is this: Scrum evolved mainly through clarification and refinement, not by adding more and more features. Then, in 2020, the Scrum Guide underwent a major transformation, becoming more streamlined, less jargon-heavy, and more universal. First, Scrum became one Scrum team, bringing the product owner, Scrum master, and developers together without sub-teams or hierarchy. Second, the team moved from self-organizing to self-managing, meaning the team determines who does what, when, and how. Third, the product goal was introduced as an explicit commitment for the product backlog, giving the team a longer-term direction beyond individual sprints. Together, these changes marked 3 important shifts: from roles to accountabilities, from self-organizing to self-managing, and from tactical sprints to product direction. Why did the Scrum Guide become smaller and less prescriptive? Because Scrum was designed to provide what is necessary for empiricism, not to prescribe every detail of implementation. It defines the core principles, accountabilities, operational boundaries, events, and required artifact commitments. But it intentionally leaves many choices open, such as domain-specific engineering techniques, estimation methods like story points, specific tools, metrics, and team structures. This reflects a deeper philosophy: principles over prescriptions, boundaries over bureaucracy, empiricism over assumption, and adaptation over rigidity. In other words, Scrum's power comes not from telling teams everything to do, but from giving them the essential structure within which they can learn and adapt. As Scrum matured, it also moved beyond its original software development boundaries. Its lightweight structure began to support complex work in banking and finance, healthcare and med tech, hardware and manufacturing, and even the public sector. The context changed, from digital products and core system modernization to clinical systems, physical products, citizen services, and adaptive policy delivery. What remained consistent was the underlying challenge: complex work requires frequent inspection, adaptation, and collaboration. Scrum was no longer simply a software development framework. It was increasingly being used as an approach for managing complex work across diverse domains. As Scrum expanded into enterprise environments, a new set of questions emerged, questions that the Scrum Guide itself does not attempt to answer. How do dozens of Scrum teams coordinate without creating heavy bureaucracy? How can leadership maintain governance and financial control without undermining adaptability? How do enterprise strategy and portfolio decisions remain connected to daily team delivery? And how do organizations measure real business value, rather than simply velocity or output? Finally, as AI and intelligent systems become part of complex knowledge work, how should accountability evolve? These questions point to an important distinction. The Scrum Guide defines the core framework, but enterprise complexity requires an expanded architecture around that core. So this leads to the next architectural layer: Scrum Guide Expanded. The official Scrum Guide defines the core framework, what Scrum is. It intentionally remains minimal, establishing accountabilities, events, and artifacts while leaving implementation details open. Scrum Guide Expanded addresses the how, the operational complexity surrounding that core, including domain practices, portfolio alignment, evidence-based management, governance, and AI. The key point is that it does not replace Scrum. It builds around Scrum to address the complexity that the intentionally incomplete framework leaves open. So the core remains Scrum. The expanded layer helps organizations apply that core in more complex environments. So, the journey from Agile to Scrum Guide Expanded is a story of continuous evolution. In 2001, the Agile Manifesto established adaptive values for complex software work. In 2010, the Scrum Guide provided a common, canonical definition of Scrum. From 2011 to 2017, the framework was refined through greater clarity, transparency, values, and purpose. Then, in 2020, Scrum became simpler, more universal, and focused on self-managing teams and product direction. And now, from 2026 onward, the next question is broader. How do we address scale, value, governance, and AI without losing Scrum's minimalist core? That is where our journey continues. In Episode 3, we go beyond minimalism and explore the Scrum Guide Expansion Pack.
Version 2.
The framework you use to manage complex work absolutely wasn't born a global standard. It was forged in a full-blown crisis. Today, we're jumping straight in to dissect exactly how Scrum evolved from a niche software practice into the definitive blueprint for modern operational agility between 2001 and 2020. So, let's look at the core question here. What actually transformed Scrum from this emerging software development idea into the world's most influential framework for managing complexity? Well, to figure that out, we first have to understand the catastrophic failure of the systems that came before it. Section 1. The problem and the paradigm shift. Think back to the late 20th century software crisis. It was completely defined by rigid systems. We relied heavily on these linear, phase-gated life cycles with deterministic scheduling. Basically, teams tried to predict every single step in advance. But here's the fatal flaw. These systems operated on the totally false assumption that complex environments were stable and that you could know everything before you even started. The result? Compounding operational risk. Dynamic requirements and rapid market shifts created this massive disconnect. Teams were delivering software that perfectly complied with outdated initial specs, but it literally failed to deliver any real user value. This compounding failure forced a true breaking point, the snowbird paradigm shift of February 2001. Traditional predictive delivery, the kind that relied heavily on rigid processes, giant stocks of documentation, and strict contract negotiation was completely overturned. Enter the new Agile Manifesto, which established adaptive delivery. The priority flipped upside down. Suddenly, it was all about individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and actually responding to change. This wasn't just a new methodology. It was a fundamental shift away from deterministic control. It prioritized actual value over rigid plans. Section 2, establishing a single source of truth. Now, a philosophical shift sounds great, but it wasn't enough to guarantee success on the ground. Between 1995 and 2009, the industry devolved into what we kind of have to call the Wild West of Scrum. Methodological drift was everywhere. Through what we call artifact corruption, teams were turning the Agile product backlog right back into an immutable, rigid requirements document. Then there was role distortion, which basically reduced the product owner to a traditional project manager just issuing tasks. And mechanical Scrum. This is where teams kept their old command and control supervision while superficially doing daily stand-ups. By 2009, practitioners genuinely couldn't distinguish real empirical Scrum from these diluted variants. The community was absolutely desperate for a single source of truth. So in 2010, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland stepped up and authored the very first canonical Scrum Guide to provide exactly that resolution. Instead of creating some massive, comprehensive methodology, they established a really lightweight framework for empirical process control. We're talking just 3 accountabilities, 5 events, and 3 artifacts. This was a strategic masterstroke. They released it under open licensing to protect the framework from proprietary fragmentation, and it instantly became the universal baseline for global transformations. Crucially, though, this baseline didn't just sit there static. Over the next decade, the framework went through continuous, highly intentional refinement. In 2011, rigid commitments were replaced with forecasts. This shifted the focus away from fixed scope compliance and toward actual empirical reality. Then, by 2016, the 5 Scrum values, commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect, were formally embedded. This was a huge deal. It shifted Scrum from being a purely mechanical process to a trust-driven ethical culture. Finally, by 2017, non-IT uses were officially clarified, which paved the way for massive cross-industry adoption. Section 3, Global Expansion and the Limits of Minimalism. That brings us to a massive evolutionary leap. The 2020 milestone. The absolute most crucial takeaway here is the complete elimination of the us versus them dynamic. The separate development team identity was dissolved completely into one unified team. They also upgraded the language from self-organizing to self-managing, meaning teams were now empowered to decide not just how to execute, but what to work on and who does it. Most importantly, the introduction of the formal product goal provided a strategic anchor for tactical execution. It perfectly aligned everything with the modern focus on actual value delivery. So how did they achieve all this scale while keeping the guide so incredibly short? Through the philosophy of less. Schwaber and Sutherland realized a pretty profound truth. The more detailed the framework became, the less adaptable it would be. Think of it like an enabling constraints sandbox. The core of the framework contains only the non-negotiable empirical boundaries, the what and the why. Everything else, all the contextual tactics or the how, sits in this purposely incomplete space. It's left entirely for self-managing teams to optimize using practices like Kanban or DevOps. The minimalism itself functions as a diagnostic tool, purposefully exposing operational friction. But hey, this intentional design does create the empiricism trade-off. The advantages are absolutely undeniable. You get universal applicability, high adaptability, and ultimate team empowerment. But the limitations are equally steep. Implementation ambiguity means that inexperienced teams often really struggle without step-by-step guidance. There's also a severe misinterpretation risk where teams just drop core rules, mistaking minimalism for permissiveness. And most critically, this creates massive scaling gaps. The framework fails entirely to define multi-team coordination, portfolio funding, or enterprise-level governance. Despite those scaling gaps, the minimalist approach worked beautifully for global adoption. When they removed software-specific language in 2020, it officially recognized Scrum as a universal operational language. It spread like wildfire beyond tech, modernizing legacy pipelines in banking and finance, accelerating research in healthcare, integrating hardware engineering in manufacturing, and even modernizing civic technology in the public sector all over the world. This widespread adoption led directly to institutional convergence. We moved from the complete separation of predictive life cycles back in the 90s, through the formal recognition of Agile in the 2010s, straight into our current era, convergence. Modern project professionals literally can no longer live in just one camp. You are now expected to seamlessly blend predictive risk management with adaptive delivery systems, unifying these frameworks based strictly on the unique context of your specific project. Yet, as operations scaled up to the massive enterprise level, the limitations of that minimalist sandbox became impossible to ignore. We're left with 7 glaring enterprise gaps. Like, how do you actually manage multi-team coordination across shared architectures? How do you move value measurement beyond just financial ROI? How do you adapt executive support for iterative backlogs? And perhaps the most urgent question today, how do we connect long-term product strategy with tactical sprint goals, optimize systems thinking, and seamlessly integrate artificial intelligence into team decision-making loops? Section 4, the future, strategy, and artificial intelligence. Let's really dive into this modern frontier. The current enterprise landscape is exposing 2 critical disconnects that traditional Agile boundaries really struggle to handle. First up is the strategy disconnect. The Scrum Guide defines a product goal, sure, but it provides 0 mechanics for how to actually formulate, validate, or fund that strategy at an enterprise portfolio level. Then there's AI participation. When automated systems and generative AI agents are executing tasks, writing code, or analyzing metrics, how do they actually fit into traditional Scrum team accountabilities? The whole traditional definition of a human developer now requires a radical expansion. This brings us to a fascinating paradox. These unanswered questions, they aren't flaws in Scrum. They're actually the mathematical result of intentional minimalism. The very thing that made Scrum a universal standard, its supreme simplicity, created the exact void that now demands structured, complementary guidance. So, what's the resolution? Well, the global community isn't replacing the official guide. Instead, they're responding with a comprehensive Scrum Guide Expanded for 2026. It integrates complexity science, systems thinking, and evidence-based management to finally bridge that massive enterprise gap. To wrap up this explainer, let's quickly review the journey we just took. The Agile Manifesto provided the necessary philosophical foundation back in 2001. By 2010, the Scrum Guide stepped in to unify a totally fractured community, using intentional minimalism to drive continuous revisions all the way up to the hyper-lean 2020 standard. But this incredible global success ultimately exposed enterprise complexities that a minimal core was just never designed to answer alone. So I'll leave you with this thought. If the ultimate framework for human collaboration now has to orchestrate non-human intelligence and massive enterprise ecosystems, how radically will your definition of agility have to change over the next decade?
Learning reinforcement.
By the late 1990s, software was rapidly becoming the engine of global business. Yet the industry responsible for building it was collapsing under its own weight. Major initiatives were routinely delivered years late. Budgets doubled, then tripled, and massive projects were canceled before a single line of code reached a customer. The root cause was the industry's reliance on predictive development. This was a management framework borrowed directly from civil engineering, operating on the assumption that you could build a digital application exactly like you build a concrete bridge, using a strict sequence of rigid, predetermined phases. Unlike concrete and steel, software requirements are deeply unstable. User needs evolve and market conditions shift on a daily basis. Attempting to lock in specifications months in advance meant developers were constantly aiming at a moving target. The industry was discovering a harsh reality of the digital age. As the complexity of a project increases, its outcome becomes less predictable. Enforcing rigid, upfront plans on an unpredictable environment did not guarantee stability. It created a dangerous illusion of control that masked compounding operational risk. In February 2001, 17 independent software practitioners gathered at a ski resort in Snowbird, Utah. Among them were Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, the co-creators of an emerging practice called Scrum. These competitors didn't meet to pitch a new product or invent a single unified methodology. They came to find common ground, to see if they could identify a shared philosophy to replace the heavy, plan-driven processes failing their teams. Their collaboration produced a remarkably brief 68-word document known as the Agile Manifesto. The document outlined 4 core values. It prioritized people and interactions over strict processes. It favored working software over excessive documentation, customer collaboration over rigid contracts, and, crucially, responding to change over following a fixed plan. This declaration did not invent the mechanics of Scrum, which had already existed for years. What it did was establish an intellectual environment where an empirical, adaptive framework could finally thrive. Following the release of the manifesto, demand for agile practices surged. Organizations worldwide searched for a practical way to implement these values, and Scrum quickly emerged as the primary vehicle of choice. As adoption exploded, a new problem arose: methodological drift. Thousands of trainers and consultants were teaching different versions of Scrum. Many organizations created hybrid Scrum butt models, adopting the daily meetings but keeping the exact same command and control supervision they were supposed to leave behind. Because there was no canonical manual, the framework was dissolving into divergent, contradictory interpretations. Practitioners were struggling to distinguish genuine empirical work from diluted variants, threatening the framework's overall effectiveness. To protect the integrity of their creation, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland intervened. In 2010, they published the first official Scrum Guide. This document provided a definitive rulebook. It codified the absolute non-negotiable baseline of the framework: 3 distinct accountabilities, 5 formal events to structure time, and 3 artifacts to ensure transparency. By releasing this standard under an open license, the creators prevented Scrum from fracturing into proprietary, competing versions. They handed the global community a single source of truth. Between 2010 and 2020, Scrum was adopted by massive global enterprises. You might expect that as the framework entered heavily regulated industries, its official guide would expand to include complex governance rules. Instead, the creators systematically shortened it to just 13 pages. This reduction was driven by intentional minimalism. The goal was defining a strict framework core, the solid inner circle, while leaving the expansive outer ring open for contextual tactics. These minimal constraints force transparency, leaving exact details to self-managing teams. This stripped-down simplicity is exactly what allowed Scrum to escape the software sector. Because it lacked domain-specific engineering jargon, it could be applied seamlessly to manufacturing lines, banking transformations, and clinical healthcare operations. However, this universal adaptability came with an inherent trade-off. By remaining so lightweight, the 2020 guide intentionally left massive organizational challenges unanswered. It provided no instructions for coordinating dozens of teams, securing executive funding, or integrating artificial intelligence. The Agile Manifesto and the official Scrum Guide were never intended to solve every problem. Their deliberate simplicity served a highly specific purpose, breaking the illusion of predictive control. They established a foundation that forces modern enterprises to face uncertainty head-on and continuously evolve to survive.
In this episode, we've explored how Scrum evolved from an emerging Agile practice into the world's most influential framework for managing complex work. Through 6 official revisions, the Scrum Guide established a common language while remaining intentionally simple, lightweight, and adaptable. Yet as Scrum expanded across industries and enterprise environments, new questions emerged about product strategy, governance, systems thinking, value measurement, and the responsible use of artificial intelligence. Those questions marked the beginning of Scrum's next evolution. In Episode 3, we'll discover why the Scrum Guide Expanded was developed, and how it extends Scrum to meet the realities of today's complex, AI-enabled organizations. Thank you for joining me on this journey. This is Infinite Business Dynamics.